Well, folks, we made it. This is the last Golden Age Disney movie. After Bambi came out, we were full on into World War II, and Disney started making propaganda films and package films, and that boom of creativity that was the Golden Age was put on pause, but not before they made Bambi, and it is a testament to just how far this studio's come in only 5 short years. Bambi. So Bambi came out in 1942 and is the 5th and final film from Disney's Golden Age. And talk about going out on a high note. I mean, Bambi may be my favorite film that Disney's made from this era. It is a masterpiece of animation and storytelling and has a narrative structure that Disney wouldn't even attempt until over 50 years later with The Lion King. And this really is a masterclass of animation. This is by far the most cinematic that Disney's ever gone, and tells a very straightforward, consistent narrative. Unlike their previous work like Fantasia and Dumbo that was more broken up into segments, I guess they weren't really sure yet how to pace it out in a way that the audience wouldn't get bored. It's a very continuous story with pretty subtle transitions from scene to scene, for the most part, but we'll get to that later. And you can tell that the animators feel a lot more confident now in their ability to tell a cinematic story. And this story is the life story of the dear Bambi. Now, I already compared Bambi to The Lion King. It's pretty obvious why. They both feature entirely animal casts. The animals talk to each other. And they're both coming-of-age stories of a young prince that needs to take on responsibility to lead their tribe into survival. But there is a significant difference that separates Lion King from Bambi, and that's that the Lion King has this hero's journey arc where Simba needs to go away for a time and then come back and learn a lesson. And Bambi really doesn't do that. Bambi doesn't need to go away and learn a lesson because he has no real personality flaws to begin with. I mean, he is a deer after all. And even though Bambi definitely has obstacles that he needs to overcome throughout this movie, it doesn't seem as concerned about developing Bambi as an individual character, but more concerned in exploring how children develop into adults in a natural and healthy way. But before we get into the plot, I have to gush about this gorgeous animation for a minute. And that's because Bambi has more shots utilizing the multiplane camera than any other Disney movie. It's like every other shot in this movie is a multiplane shot, and they get really creative with it. And if there was ever a movie to really take advantage of this, it is Bambi, because you're in the forest. There's trees and rocks and shrubs and streams and waterfalls everywhere. And if you use this technology right, you can achieve so much depth and contrast and depth of field that it really gives you a sense that you're in this forest with these animals. And whenever I'm explaining the multiplane camera to people in my day-to-day life, because I'm just as big a nerd off camera as I am on it, maybe even more so, I always use Bambi as an example because it just, look at what they're doing with it. There's no better movie to explain it because the depth that you can achieve in a forest is only limited to however many planes of glass they have, and I swear they used every single one that they had available. And the improvements in animation aren't just limited to the backgrounds and the multiplane shots, but also in the character animations themselves. I mean, just look at the character of Bambi. Bambi's design is proof that these animators were really starting to study animal anatomy, and drawing from reference from both photographs and live animals that they brought into the studio. And even though these animals are somewhat exaggerated, especially in the face, you can definitely see a more realistic approach compared to the deer that we see in Snow White. And it's this overall excellence in animation that makes me appreciate Bambi more and more every time I watch it. Because when I was a little kid, I wasn't a big fan of Bambi, and no, it wasn't because the mother died and that's sad. I just thought it was kind of boring. But as an adult, I've realized just how great this movie really is, in a large part because of the A+ animation, but also because of the storytelling. So let's get into that. So the movie starts out in the forest, of course, and Bambi's born to this royal family, and everyone's excited to see the young prince, and Bambi wakes up and he's cute and adorable, and he falls down, and he makes some fast friends with Thumper the rabbit and Flower the skunk. Oh, and Bambi meets a young female deer named Faline, who I wouldn't say he befriends, but I guess is more weirded out and confused by. But obviously when they're older, they're gonna fall in love and mate and, raise a family. That's just the way these kind of stories always go. But this is what I love about the storytelling of Bambi. It's such a true and relatable representation of what childhood and adolescence is like. Because when you're a child, you're new to the world, you don't understand everything, and you're constantly bumping into things that you don't understand, and then you learn, and then you adapt. And that's what we see Bambi do throughout a lot of this movie. But even when it comes to making friends, I'm sure when you were a little kid, you had friends that were more obnoxious and loudmouth like Thumper, and you had friends that were more passive and quiet like Flower. And when it comes to boys and girls, when they're little kids, they don't understand each other at all. For me as a little kid, it always seemed like the girl was in on some joke that we didn't understand. Because, you know, girls mature faster than boys and we're a little slow on the uptake. But childhood innocence has to end sometime, and this movie chooses to end it in the winter with the death of Bambi's mom. And it is sad. And as sad as it is, this scene always fascinated me because it's handled with a lot of subtlety. You don't see Bambi's mom actually getting shot, and you don't see a body, you don't even see her fall. You see them both running, you hear a gunshot, you see Bambi come back to look for her, and you see the great prince there, and he tells him that your mother can't be with you anymore. And then you see that one solitary tear drip down Bambi's face, and now the entire audience is in tears. But I can't help but wonder, if we did see that body, would it have hit as hard? Because without seeing it, our imagination fills in the blank, and what our imagination can come up with is a lot scarier and sadder than anything that we would actually see. But enough about that. It's springtime and it's happy, and stop your crying. I promise that it's going to be a happy ending. I promise. Just don't leave the theater. And that's basically why this is the most abrupt transition in the movie, and arguably the most abrupt transition in the entire Disney canon, because they knew how effective that scene was and they didn't want to traumatize their audience too much. But anyway, it's springtime now and all the animals have grown up. They've reached maturity. Bambi's got a pretty nice rack, if I do say so myself. What? Bambi's a guy? Now it's time for Bambi and his animal friends to get Twitter-pated and find a mate. In true adolescent fashion, Bambi, Thumper, and Flower all object. They say that's weird and they're never going to fall in love. They're never going to get Twitter-pated. But wouldn't you know, one by one, they all come across a very attractive animal of their species, and they succumb to it. This is where Bambi finally starts warming up to Faline, but he's got a competitor, so he needs to fight. And this scene where the two deer go at it may be the most intense scene in the whole movie, because the lighting is so dramatic. And you can barely even make out the two deer because they're just intertwined in each other's antlers. And you can only make them out by the rim lighting around them. And it all just adds to the intensity. And I wish more Disney movies went this stylistic route when things really ramped up. Imagine how much more intense Simba's final confrontation with Scar would have been if they took a similar approach, just with the flames instead of the woods. It would have been so cool. So Bambi, of course, wins that fight and takes Faline, and they get all romantic together. But that's fairly short-lived because Man is back in the forest, and there's more of them, and it's dangerous and scary. And I will say that the characterization of Man in this movie is not a favorable one, and it does kind of paint a negative stereotype of hunters that has been perpetuated in culture, to the point where there's such a disconnect between how hunters actually act and how culture perceives hunters as. And I do think Bambi is a cause of that, so that kind of bothers me. But on the other hand, this is taken from the point of view of animals and wildlife and deer, and no matter how nice the hunter is in his regular life, they're not going to have a favorable opinion on someone that comes into their territory and shoots their family. That's just not going to happen. So looking at it that way, I do kind of give it a pass for the sake of the story. And the hunter stereotype isn't nearly as exaggerated or offensive as it is in later movies, so it's not that big of an issue. And Man is depicted in a very interesting way in this movie because you never see Man. You don't see his face, you don't see his guns, you don't see any part of him. You only see his effect on nature, which is really clever because that's really all that the animals would see too. But even though you never see Man, there is something that differentiates him from everything else in nature, and that's the fact that Man is the only character that utilizes sound effects. When you hear the guns going off, that's a sound effect. When Man sets his dogs on the loose, the dogs barking, that's a sound effect. None of the deer, none of the other animals, and none of the other natural elements make sound effects. And this is taken right out of the playbook of Fantasia because aside from Man, all the sounds that you hear are musical instruments. It's a score and soundtrack that makes up what you hear, and it's perfectly synced to the action on screen that you don't even notice. And by giving nature this musical quality, it makes Man seem even more alien to the world around him. And it's taken to the point where even straight silence is a signifier of the presence of Man. Because when Bambi's mom first tells him about Man's presence in the forest, there is 5 straight seconds of dead silence right after she says Man's name. You tell me any other animated movie, Disney or otherwise, that has the guts to give us 5 straight seconds of silence to let this idea sink in. It doesn't happen very often. But nevertheless, Man is back, and their campfire starts a wildfire that ends up burning down a large portion of the forest, which is definitely a problem, but not before one of the hunters gets a good shot off into Bambi's hip, wounding him. And that's a detail that I forgot was even in this movie. Bambi does get shot. He's mortally wounded, lying there on the ground as the fire is raging around him, and his father, the great prince of the forest, comes up and tells him to get up, and they go and make a getaway. And it's here where I realize just how clever and subtle this movie really is, because the first lesson that Bambi learned was to get up and stand, and he learned that from his mother. And it seems like the final lesson that Bambi learns before starting a family of his own is also to stand up. Even when you're wounded, you still have to stand up and take responsibility for yourself. And he learned that from his dad. So whether the animators knew they were doing this or not, and they probably knew it, they bookended this movie with this lesson of standing up in the face of adversity. And that's a really important lesson to include in a movie that's at best a nature documentary and at worst the world's most expensive Smokey the Bear ad. At least that was until James Cameron's Avatar. But Bambi is so much more than either one of those. It's a coming of age story. It's a story about learning and growing and adapting and never giving up, and ultimately becoming who you're destined to be. But those are my thoughts on Bambi, and it may be the best movie that Disney's made so far. I don't know, I'm always conflicted between this and Snow White. They're both so good and tell such great stories, but Bambi's animation is admittedly a lot better than Snow White, but accounting for the time period, Snow White was so ahead of its time. But I don't know, seeing Bambi just now, it's just so much more advanced than anything that's come before it. And it pulls it off with flying colors. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Bambi? Is it the crown jewel of Disney's golden age? Let me know. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content. And hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk. And I'll see you in the next video.